is a place that you live in that is welcoming and accepting to all.
It means a good group of friends, a good group of neighbors, and a good community of friendship.
It's where you work, your kids go to school, you have entertainment, you have sports, you have culture.
Cities. They are where most of us live, work, and play. Constantly evolving, cities attempt to balance the needs of their community. But history shows that the road to building a humane city is often a bumpy one with people left behind. I'm Grant Hardy, and this is Road to Inclusion. Ideally, our cities would be designed to accommodate and encourage a whole and healthy life for everyone. But the reality is a lot more complex, especially for people in the disability community.
My name is Elaine Lee, and I was born with osteogenesis imperfecta, which means brittle bones. And so I wasn't expected to live past the age of 2 years old, but here I am, and I'm much older than 2. I'm actually 41, and I'm mobility challenged in that I cannot walk, so I normally rely on my electric wheelchair to get me around.
A constant frustration for Elaine is that going anywhere is far more complicated than it should be, especially in her current city, Calgary.
I find that the city is not properly plowing the streets, and so all of the snow gets dumped onto the side of the roads, and it blocks off every bus stop and pedestrian walkway. So here in Calgary, I have to rely majority of the time on their Calgary Transit Access system, and it's a door-to-door transportation service. You do end up getting to where you need to go, but everything has to be pre-booked. And there's so many rules and regulations about how you book and where you can go, and at what times you can go to certain places or get picked up.
For Elaine, independence of movement is a key ingredient to a livable city. And she's not alone. The blind community also finds barriers to independent navigation, with complex intersections and shared road spaces being 2 important issues.
I'm Richard Marion, and I have been involved in accessibility issues for people with disabilities for a number of years. I am blind and had a guide dog up until last year, so my primary method of getting around now for orientation mobility is using a white cane. Some intersections do have the traffic islands of slip lanes on either side, so you have to cross the main street and then potentially cross a traffic island and then one turning lane for cars turning right on to the street that you might be crossing as well to, or off that main street. I got a strong background in orientation mobility when I was a teenager in high school, and really focused on developing my orientation mobility skills. But for most people, that may not be an option, especially people that are recently losing their sight. So then it becomes potentially more of a safety issue, because the priority for intersections like that is movement of traffic.
Safety is a common concern in the community, and Surrey resident Michaela Robinson knows a thing or two about it, as she experienced one of the most terrifying incidents a pedestrian can.
I was hit by a car when I was crossing the street to come home back to my apartment from doing some shopping, and the person didn't even notice notice me even though I press the button. It's because of my short stature that if I'm in a crosswalk, people don't even see me. And when I'm crossing, and when I'm trying to cross, actually, I see cars zipping by the intersection, and I'm like, stop, please, I'm trying to cross.
Although physically Michaela came away unscathed, the accident negatively affected her confidence and sense of freedom.
It makes me feel nervous getting around places now because I have to wait until I'm with one of my staff in my apartment to go across to that little shopping area that I was at.
In Calgary, Elaine also has experienced the challenges of waiting around for others to plan out her day, a process that can lead to feeling more like a number than a person.
Since moving to Calgary, I think that if people just know that I'm always fighting to get what I need, even just to get a ride to get out my door, is like a challenge.
As our cities grow and change, it's clear more needs to be done to make residents feel comfortable, included, and safe. And there are people working to make that happen. Road to Inclusion will return. I'm Grant Hardy, and you're watching Road to Inclusion. As a person with lived experience of having a disability, I know when I meet a pain point in my environment, and I'm happy to advocate for braille signage at washrooms, tactile markings at curb cuts, or an audible cross signal. But designing a space to be accessible for everybody requires training and the right mindset.
I'm Brad McKennell. I'm the Vice President of Access and Inclusion for the Rick Hansen Foundation. My primary role is to develop and maintain the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program.
Although advocates play a viable role in identifying accessibility issues in their communities, Brad believes that professionalization is key to a better future.
If a developer comes in and says, I want to build this building, and the mayor says, well, you have to go through my disability committee first. He says, sure. He throws the plans on the table, rolls it out, and the committee looks at it and says, you know what, you need a ramp right there. Developer says, sure, we can do that. What's that look like? And all of a sudden, the committee starts to design a ramp. Where the problem comes in is if you start designing things and our architect or developer says, okay, we're going to take that design you created of a ramp and we're going to build it, and somebody falls on that ramp, then who's liable? Well, it's not the advocate. It's going to be the architect. So the architect says, well, I thank you for your advice, but I'm going back to building code because that's where I'm safe. And so we end up with people who know better building things that are not truly accessible. They meet code, but code's so woefully behind the real needs of the community of people with disabilities. But we have to find a way, we needed to find a way that the industry could get information they could rely on. Accredited people who have gone through examination, people who have taken courses, people who understand the built environment. And so that's the professionalization I'm talking about. I want the industry to be able to call on a consultant and have credibility behind it. It's not just some guy we called up and said, hey, let's create some access. It's someone with real experience. It's someone who's worked in the built environment, someone who understands the industry side of the issues and still meets the needs of the community. The community has to identify the issues. Our job is to deliver the solutions.
Their solution is a highly vetted tool that professionals can use to provide recommendations on making a space accessible and celebrating innovative work.
So what we're trying to do is create a system where we can identify what's actually there using common language and common methodology. So when you do another rating in another place, it's comparable.
Entrepreneur and Surrey resident Stan Lionhorst helped develop the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program. Since then, he's started his own company, Universal Access Design.
I broke my neck 44 years ago, which rendered me a quadriplegic. So some of the things that I do would be disability awareness training. That's a small part of my business. Both simulation training for people using wheelchairs, and there's also a vision component to it. We add a little bit about hearing disabilities and others, give them a little bit of experience. Not that they know everything, but the idea is to create empathy, so they have a better understanding why we're suggesting things around the design world. Then a big part of my work is built environment assessment work, where I will go in and analyze the existing conditions of a facility or a group of facilities, and then provide the clients with an existing conditions report and a recommendation report to upgrade it. I also write design manuals for clients to guide them in new builds or upgrades. And I've done that for universities and BC Parks, for instance, and other clients.
Universal access means access for everyone, so it's not surprising Stan has noticed an interesting result.
When you build a house that is usable by somebody with a disability, there are no noticeable changes that make it look institutional. It's just usable. So I get comments quite often from who we call able-bodied people who go, well, this is great. And I go, yeah, I know, because it's designed for me, but it's also designed for you. And that's ultimately the goal of universal design is you consider the needs of the users, and in this case, everybody, and then you try to design something that everybody can use. So it doesn't matter your ability. It shouldn't matter what your ability is. It should be seamless, independent, individual use regardless.
Brad agrees.
And we have an awareness program called Everyone Everywhere. And the idea is everyone needs access everywhere. But the juxtaposition of that is everyone will need access, because it doesn't matter whether you do a face plant at Whistler when you're a teenager and you end up quadriplegic in a wheelchair, or you're 85 and you need a walker. You are going to have a disability. The only question is when and for how long. And so it affects everyone. There's 24%, I think, Canadians identify as having a disability right now. But that number hides the fact that every one of them has at least one person in their lives. Mother, sister, brother, aunt, best friend, even if it's a paid caregiver. There's one other person that also benefits from barrier-free design.
Architect Jane Vorbrod experienced this firsthand.
About 5 years ago, I started my own firm. My cousin became disabled after some pretty major surgery. And what happened was she was discharged from the hospital, and there was nowhere really for her to live because she was suddenly in a power chair. She needed help and care. Any place that the family would look for her to go move to, she didn't fit into the bathroom door or the bedroom door, or she couldn't even get into the building. So my aunt actually asked me, like, Jane, can you help us design a house for your cousin? And of course I said yes. I realized that the resources were slim. The books that I could find were pretty depressing. A lot of them were quite old and clinical, or the designs that I saw looked kind of institutional, and that was absolutely not what I wanted to do. My cousin is a filmmaker. She's young. I wanted like a house that was inspiring and happy and happened to include the functionality that was required.
After taking the Rick Hansen Foundation's accessibility certification training, Jane carved out a niche creating spaces for all.
It's easier to get people on board when you talk about design in terms of universal design versus accessible, because people can immediately understand how it impacts themselves and the people in their more immediate circles.
Brad shared a similar philosophy.
The magic button that opens the door on buildings or washrooms, it's got that little wheelchair guy on it. You go to Vegas, you don't see that, because they understand that that little wheelchair guy puts off a lot of older adults and seniors who don't see themselves as disabled. This idea of identifying me by I have to use a power door, labeling me disabled. What's that for? I don't understand why you would even want to do that. It opens the door is what it does. So it's that kind of thing. It's that kind of attitude. Stop labeling me disabled. Stop segregating me. I don't want special service. I don't need special service if you design it right.
Clearly, inclusive cities require open minds and innovative thinking, something urban planners are starting to realize. Road to Inclusion will return. Welcome back to Road to Inclusion. I'm Grant Hardy. Although most cities have a long history, urban planning is relatively new. And as the discipline has evolved, so have ideas about building truly inclusive cities.
We've spent more than half a century planning cities primarily for cars and primarily for people who look and act like me, like cis, hetero, straight, white male, able-bodied. My name is Mitchell Reardon, and I'm the senior planner at Happy City, an urban planning, design, and housing consultancy.
Mitchell is generally pleased with the direction accessibility is heading in Metro Vancouver.
More recently, we're starting to see, I think, some improvements here. At a really basic level, that's things like ensuring that, curb cuts are in place, tactile paving is in place, accessible pedestrian crossings are used. But then there's still lots of areas for improvement. In a lot of cities, snow clearance is left to individual homeowners or businesses, which, if you're trying to, use the sidewalk after a snowstorm and the snow rise, even like a couple of inches, is going to impede your wheelchair, that's really going to cause serious challenges. And even just having more trip planning information, like, knowing where accessible public washrooms are going to be and the confirmed presence of curb cuts are things that are starting to come, but they're certainly not, widespread yet.
The demand for a wider variety of transportation on Metro Vancouver's streets can be a source of conflict. One example is floating bus stops, which as a member of the blind community concerns Richard Marion.
The big issue with floating bus stops is pedestrian safety getting on and off the bus, because where they tend to be located, they tend to be located on the road side of a separated bike lane. So if you get off the bus, go to the front of the bus and go to the sidewalk, you may not even realize that you've actually entered a bike lane unless there's some sort of accessibility feature to indicate that.
Pedestrian safety is a big issue for cities, particularly for those that prioritize walkability.
It is something that we need to kind of keep focusing on as our streets get more complex and keep learning from what we have out there. I'm Paul Storer, and I'm the Director of Transportation for the City of Vancouver. And I'm also the staff liaison to the city's Persons with Disabilities Advisory Committee. Particularly when you get to accessibility, the details matter. At the bus stops, we've been looking at them, and we've been trying out a number of different tools. Like every design's been a little bit different, and a lot of that is on the details about how we kind of communicate where that stop is to the blind or visually impaired pedestrian, and how we really communicate to people cycling that they really need to stop. The intersections are where I worry the most, because sending the wrong signal there to a visually impaired or blind pedestrian can have them end up on the roadway in a potentially dangerous situation, which is something that we want to avoid at all costs.
Paul describes some of the design initiatives and challenges around intersections.
We've kind of landed on design solutions at least for now, for more complex areas where we have kind of bevel detectable curbs that can kind of lead, that are navigable by people using wheelchairs, but are detectable with the white cane, and that can be kind of understood by service animals. And then kind of at those crossings where we aren't able to get, where we have those more complex conditions, starting to use tactile warning surface indicators. So we're going to be seeing those kind of coming up a lot more anywhere where there's kind of complexity on the system. And I think it's kind of an ongoing question that we're still exploring around, whether we should be looking at those at all intersections to be providing more clarity, and more consistency around the city. I think one of the things that we really struggle with around consistency is we're only rebuilding a small number of locations at any point. So any decisions we make, it'll take a long time to roll out.
Things are changing outside large urban centers as well. Once the domain of cars, many suburbs are also dealing with competing forms of mobility, like the city of Surrey, a suburb of Vancouver that has quickly grown into the second largest population center in BC.
I'm Douglas McLeod. I'm the Transportation Planning Manager here at the City of Surrey in the Transportation Division at the Engineering Department. One big thing that we're doing is recognizing that there are different variable speeds of users. So we've got the kind of conventional road users on vehicles, but really recognizing that in the kind of boulevard realm, there is the slow users who are people walk at a slower speed. They don't travel too fast, and they need a separate area from the medium speed users that are in things like obviously bikes, scooters, wheelchairs, motorized scooters and wheelchairs. So I think that's an important distinction that we're learning and making sure that we're providing spaces as best as possible for each where we can. The city has adopted a Vision Zero road safety standard, with the Vision Zero specifically being working towards a goal of having zero deaths and serious injuries on all our roads. And so even with that principle in mind, even though it's very auto-focused, it still doesn't mean that we're not trying to look at reducing all conflict between pedestrians and cyclists as well, because we consider those the highest, the most vulnerable road users. For example, the pedestrian and cyclist conflict zones, having maybe some sort of tactile treatment on the ground to indicate where you are in that space, and other appropriate signage or markings for cyclists to understand and better expect those conflicts, particularly with people who have visual impairments.
With road safety being critical for blind and partially sighted pedestrians, Douglas describes some initiatives the City of Surrey has for making roads safer.
We have 425 traffic signals throughout the city right now. And so we're quite proud that 212 of the 425 have accessible pedestrian signals. So they've got what we call vibro tactile response buttons. So you press and you can actually feel that you've activated it. And there's the audible information letting you know that the crossing is on. We're implementing them with all brand new signals, and every time we do what we call a signal rebuild, so we take an old signal and have to replace it with brand new infrastructure. So that's one thing that we're very proud of, is that all the new infrastructure is coming in with that. We are working on programs for retrofitting the kind of medium age signals that don't require the full rebuild, but again, don't have, we're historically not designed with that type of infrastructure in mind. We also have 88 signals around the city that have what we call leading pedestrian intervals. And those leading pedestrian intervals allows the pedestrians to start walking before the traffic moving in the same direction goes, which is great for something for what we call right turn on reds. There's a lot of commuting, particularly for people who are visually impaired. So it allows people to get out and walk out into the intersection before any traffic moves, so that you're a lot more visible to the drivers.
As Douglas explains, sometimes design features put different user groups into conflict.
For us, active transportation people, it's all great. Why wouldn't you do these at every single intersection? But yeah, you get this well, why is the signal leading these pedestrians when there's no people there and it's impacting my commute time?
As cities grow, public transit plays an important role in keeping people moving and reducing car dependency. TransLink is the overseeing body for transportation in the Metro Vancouver region, including the buses and trains residents ride on a daily basis. Jill Drews, TransLink spokesperson, describes some of the accessibility initiatives TransLink offers.
Public transit is a connection for people to, the people in places they love, their jobs, their schools, and that system needs to work for everybody. So these signs involve tactile walking service indicators at stations and bus exchanges, and signs with information in Braille on what, information that a sighted person can easily get by reading the bus stop pole. We also have a very robust training program for staff, especially bus operators. They receive several days of training focused solely on supporting customers with a wide range of disabilities or cognitive issues. This includes in-depth training for positioning mobility devices on buses in a respectful way and a safe way, assisting visual and hearing impaired customers. And we also have training programs for people who want to take the system but may be unsure or afraid that they'll be able to do it. We have a lot of travel training programs on a variety of different issues. I think one that's really exciting that we recently launched is our partnership with Autism BC, creating these 3D online tools to help people with autism feel more confident when traveling on buses. It sort of allows them to get like a virtual tour of the bus before they're actually on a bus. So that may help relieve some of the anxiety about traveling alone on transit.
One thing TransLink, Surrey, and Vancouver have in common is that they recognize the benefit of accessibility and universal access. Douglas McLeod.
Again, I was always a huge advocate for the accessibility community, but man, owning a stroller, I wish every full-bodied person would own a stroller. Because I think once they do that, they would understand many of the issues the accessibility community faces. Because you all of a sudden start noticing every missing curb cut, every misaligned curb cut, and placement of elevators and all sorts of things that you're like, I never really picked up all the time on this before, and now I have a stroller and this is really hard to navigate.
More on evolving cities when we return to Road to Inclusion. I'm Grant Hardy, and this is Road to Inclusion. The blind community appears to be entering another watershed moment in outdoor navigation as we now compete for public space with an ever-expanding variety of devices, such as scooters, bikes, segways, and other e-devices. And according to Calgary's Elaine Lee, dialogue and consultation are important.
Because it's very hard to put yourself in someone's shoes when you don't live that lifestyle. If you're not in a chair on a regular basis, or you're not blind, or you don't have to deal with all these mobility and disability issues, then you won't really know what you actually need.
However, legally blind architect Jim Taggart isn't sure the community's voice is being heard, particularly in his Vancouver neighborhood.
That section of the seawall, actually specifically between Granville Island and Cambie Bridge, has recently been, last few years, has been upgraded. And what that's done is it's taken what used to be a mixed single path that had bikes and strollers and people walking dogs and other people, joggers even, mixed together into something where the seawall has been separated into two lanes, the inner one being cycling and the outer one being pedestrians. Now, I think because, bicycles are leg powered, and every time you stop, you have to go through that process of starting again. Cyclists would much rather just skirt around you than they would stop, even if it's at a crosswalk. And interestingly, I've spoken to people who navigate with a guide dog or with a cane, and you see very few of them on the seawall. And when I speak to them, they say, well, it's all too easy now to drift across that white line that divides the pedestrians from fast-moving bicycle traffic. Or if you're using a guide dog trained to follow the curb, it will take one of those sort of lane dividers that are occasionally there on the seawall, and it will follow that divider round and take you, unsuspectingly into the cycle path.
Jim doesn't feel cities are doing enough to tackle this important issue.
I think Ken actually made this point. I happened to be walking up to the gym up Ash Street, and the surveyor was out trying to ask, when I survey a sort of public survey kind of thing, asking pedestrians what they thought about the idea of converting this into a bike route. And I said to them, I think it'll actually be more dangerous because cars will stop at this four-way stop we're standing at, but cyclists typically will not. So I think for me as a visually impaired person, it will be more dangerous. And that's exactly how it's proven to be.
Jim feels a tactile marker at the very least would help people with this dangerous design choice.
Basically 2-foot wide bands of yellow, bumpy surface that you have when you were about to fall into a SkyTrain track would be a really useful thing to have anytime you encounter a cycle path, because they are, in fact, well, they're not as dangerous as falling off a platform and being electrocuted, but somebody traveling on a bike, and these electric bikes now are going at 30 or 40 kilometers an hour, and they have an extra mass because they got a motor on them. They're quiet, and they're, for me, who's got, dappled vision at the very best, you can have somebody who's moving silently and swiftly through a bunch of blind spots, and you never know they're there.
The issue of our limited and shared public spaces is huge, but sometimes traveling hundreds of kilometers feels easier than walking 50 meters. As Richard Marion points out, indoor navigation is arguably the greatest navigational barrier for the blind community.
Getting to the pharmacy still may not be the issues, but it's once you get into the pharmacy, and I know our local pharmacy is got to be one of the busiest stores at the local mall, and it's a bit stressful sort of getting through that.
The field of accessible indoor navigation technology promises a vastly different future. David Brunn of Gateway Navigation has experience traveling with a guide dog and white cane. He talks about that promising future.
There's a lot of really slick, interesting technology that's happening that beyond just finding the information about the storefront that you're going into, but actually to navigate within those environments that are make it a lot easier to do. And that comes down to a building block that has to happen within interior spaces in which 3D digital maps are created. And those 3D digital maps are being created for the sighted community also, for use for people who use Apple Maps or Google Maps or any other map platform, which is expanding into the indoor environment.
Essentially, this means some of the same technology that's used in mainstream indoor navigation can also be used to empower blind travelers. And in what better spot to pilot this technology than in a busy shopping mall?
CF Civic Center is in downtown Vancouver. It stretches about 3 city blocks from Robson to Pender Street. And we probably host around, millions of customers and visitors annually through the property, both locally and internationally. My name is Kim Figacelli, and I am the General Manager for CF Civic Center Retail. Using the app, it's going to bring you back to how you got into the shopping center initially, which is really critical. The shopping center, is 3 city blocks long. It's challenging at times getting through and finding the entrance. So I found that really interesting part of the app. The other feature that was actually quite beneficial during this time is it told you about the COVID restrictions that were in place within our shopping center, and even how to locate the closest hand sanitizer. So even those little services that we have available, which someone who's vision impaired may not get to enjoy, this app is delivering on those and, providing them that assistance and how to access those services.
David's hopes for indoor navigation are high.
It's just creating an environment in which you're not believing that you're a burden, or that you're not having a level of independence that allows you to compete or to be equal to the peers around you.
Since we spend an inordinate amount of time inside buildings, it's critical that they be accessible, but just as importantly, they need to be healthy. And one way to do that is to bring some of the natural world indoors.
So biophilic design is based on the idea, while biophilia is love of nature. And so again, it's a lens that you wear as a jumping off point when you're imagining design. And it's all about bringing nature into the built environment. My name is Sarah Ratty, and I'm a project manager at an organization called Lighthouse. So imagine you have a building and you can actually open your window. This is not always the case. I mean, certainly for residential buildings, you can open your windows, but a lot of offices don't. And imagine how much of an impact that makes, especially if you don't have that opportunity. So you open your window and you feel the breeze come in. You can smell the change of the weather. You can see the change of day and seasons. You can perhaps hear the wildlife outside that's attracted to the plants that you've incorporated into the design of your space. So there are all these opportunities. They're incredibly subtle, but when you don't have these things, you really notice it. And it's all about creating restorative spaces, spaces that foster a love of nature, a connection with nature. It's really a movement toward no longer being dominant over nature, which has been the paradigm for a long time now.
From changing trends to shifting paradigms, what the future has in store for our cities when we return to Road to Inclusion. I'm Grant Hardy, and you're watching Road to Inclusion. For many, like Power Chair user Elaine Lee, the urban jungle can present too many barriers.
Even some places in downtown Calgary are not accessible. And that's the issue, I think, that people forget, is that they have to be aware of all people, not just people who are able-bodied and can walk. Even just to get into a building should be simpler than having to cry for help.
Still, despite the challenges in our evolving cities, Stan Lionhurst of Universal Access Design says we're trending in the right direction.
The level of accessibility is way better than it was 40 years ago. And that's driven by a number of things. One of them, of course, would be the advocates for increasing the level of accessibility. People like Rick Hansen, Terry Fox, Sam Sullivan. I mean, they've really pushed that envelope a lot. And of course, I'm building on their shoulders.
If we acknowledge that universal access benefits everyone, Brad McCannell says that opens up some unique possibilities.
Riddle me this. If you were a developer and instead of doing 10% of your project as accessible housing, whatever that means, it usually means turn it into an institution and put a bunch of grab bars in and call it a day. But if that's your choice, what if we did it another way? What if the bottom floor of every new condo building was designed so that it could be say 4 suites with a caregiver? And as you grow older, even in that same building, you could graduate down to the first floor, and that would become, instead of a giant warehouse full of people, every condo would have 4 suites, 5 suites of people with disabilities and older adults and seniors still living in the building they started in. But what you'd end up with is small care homes all over the place.
The pandemic has certainly shown us the importance of nature and the outdoors in our cities, which is why accessing these spaces is also important. Neil Avon, manager of parks for the City of Surrey, shared an interesting initiative.
The city is currently working on developing a virtual park tour program, which will allow park users in Surrey to engage and review a given park's accessibility prior to their visit. The virtual tours will help them plan for the areas that may be challenging to them from an accessibility or mobility perspective.
Ultimately, Neil says that cities need to focus on diversity.
A city must be a leader in the realm of diversity and inclusion through that meaningful engagement with our diverse public. And I think Surrey's doing well in that regard, and as we build a city for all.
Paul Starr with the City of Vancouver agrees.
It's really critical for us to be thinking of all of our residents, regardless of everything from gender to where they come from to whether or not they have a disability. And accessibility is a big part of that.
Brad McCannell describes one of the simplest, most important ways of promoting accessibility, universal access, and healthy cities. Hire people from the community.
That's a really unique group. That's a really specialized group. That's a group of people highly trained, typically well-educated. I always say, what's the fastest way to create access in your office, Brad? What's the very fastest way I can do that? Well, the best thing you can do is just hire a person with disabilities. Stop talking about it. Stop worrying about it. Stop humming and hawing. Just hire somebody. And a miracle will happen. Your office will suddenly become more and more accessible, not because you have to, not because it's code, but because Brad works here now.
By being inclusive, Calgary resident Elaine Lee believes future cities will be better places.
But if they are accessible, I think that's a good start to making the world more open-minded and kind-hearted.
Richmond's Richard Marion agrees.
Is the sort of ongoing consultation and respect for inclusive design principles, so people aren't being left out, in that we can make our urban spaces user friendly for everybody.
Surrey resident Michaela Robinson describes her dream city.
Everything close by, easy to get to, easy to cross streets easily, be able to change the way things are done easily.
A city is only as strong as its communities and leaders. That's why, even though I know my city, Vancouver, faces many daily accessibility challenges, I believe it can become more compassionate, accessible, and inclusive. But representation matters, because cities aren't just a reflection of those who live there. They're also a reflection of those making decisions, wielding influence, and holding power. By building spaces for all, we can ensure that everyone can get out and safely explore the urban jungle. Host Grant Hardy. Producers Grant Hardy and Matandon. Videographer-editor Sergio Vera Barahona. Integrated Described Video Specialist M. Williams. Audio producer, composer, and editor Mike Monson. Graphics Andrew Antonello. Senior producer Michelle Dudis. President and CEO David Arrington. Copyright 2021 Accessible Media Incorporated.